Good morning. This is going to be the CISSP course, and if you're not in the CISSP course, the Advanced Ethicals across the street in the next room in Manassas A. We usually do get a couple people that are either in that room and supposed to be in this one, and then vice versa. So just as a warning, this is the CISSP. There are no labs. It's all going to be lecture, so that's another fun part. Okay, testing material. I'm going to cover the 10 domains of the CISSP. Things that we will be covering, of course, will be telecommunications. It's probably the biggest bulk of the CISSP as far as domains are considered. How many people here have the Net Plus or have studied for the Net Plus? That's going to help you a lot on the CISSP because this entire domain is the Net Plus test from CompTIA. Then we're going to do security management practices, of course, the AppSec, security development, the crypto. How many people here have heard of the quote-unquote crypto test as far as the CISSP is concerned? Basically, what ISC squared does is they have about 25 questions that are beta, which do not count towards your final score. But what I've seen is that a lot of the questions they have on beta, they usually bulk together as far as the specific domains they're covering. So the people that are taking the test, they get the quote-unquote crypto test. A lot of those are probably going to be beta questions. So if you get more than, I was at 7.5 to 10% of the test as being crypto, a lot of them are probably going to be a throwaway. In all honesty, they just won't count if you miss them. Yeah, it would be nice to know if they had a big B right next to them saying they're beta, but unfortunately with this test they don't. So it's one of those things where you can get all the beta right, but if you get the wrong questions after that wrong, then it's going to be bad for you. But if you get all the beta wrong and get everything else right, it's going to be great. Security architecture and models, OPSEC or operations security, also business continuity planning, which is the fun one. They do not have it here, but basically it also covers disaster recovery, which is just going to be your IT centers, all your data, and business continuity is the whole business. It's also laws, investigations, and ethics. Again, this is going to be the forensics part and the laws. With the CISSP, you will have to memorize a lot of the cyber law that's out there, as far as, for example, like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in 1996, or that's when it was revised because it was originally written in '86. And like the Economic Espionage Act as well. So there's going to be a lot of content that basically you're just going to have to memorize. It's also physical security and access control and methodology. As far as physical security, that's another thing with the people that are the quote-unquote propeller heads or the techs that have a lot of experience in telecom and crypto or whatnot. Sometimes they do not have the experience in physical, which is probably one of the harder domains for most people, that and crypto. Okay, exam specs. It was 4 years full-time in the 3 years. Recently they changed it to you have to have 5 years full-time experience in 2 CBKs or more, or you can have a degree and it'd only be 4 years. So they basically made it a little bit more difficult to become a CISSP as far as experience and background goes. How many people here deal with the DoD 8570.1M? Which is going to be a reg that basically says that you have to have specific certifications to do specific job types. There's like the, for example, the IAM, which is Information Assurance Management, and IAT, which is Information Assurance Technical. On the first draft, they made it to where you had to have a CISSP or CISM if you're management, or a CISSP or a CISA if you're going to be technical. But the CISSP was basically all-encompassing. The second draft, they actually put in the CNDs, which are Computer Network Defense. And then they also had the service provider management. And I'll go ahead and bring up that document a little bit later. But basically it has it to where they have the CISSP associate. So if you don't have your 5 years or 4 years plus a degree, then basically you can still take the test, but it's going to be at the quote-unquote associate level. Until you finally get your experience in, then you become a full CISSP. And yes? Did you retake the test? No. You just have to keep up your CPEs, which are continuing professional education credits. Once you keep those up, then it just is a natural transgression. But one thing that they really push, though, is that you do have to have multiple domains now. And the CPEs. Used to be, they're relatively lax as far as you can have, say, 15 one year, and then 20 the next, and then fill up the rest in the next year. but they've really been pushing for, you have to have a minimum of 20 per year now. And if you don't get the minimum of 20 per year, then you get your little email reminder saying you're going to lose your CISSP if you don't complete the minimum. And at the end of the 3-year period, or the 36-month period, you have to have 120 CPEs. And the CPEs are relatively easy to get. I know a lot of people wait to the last minute to get their CPEs, and there's a lot of free items as well. For example, you can do CBTs, or computer-based training. So if you do the Microsoft TechNet, a lot of times those will count as well. And basically it's a CPE per hour of the, or CPE for the CBT. Also, how many people here are members of like InfraGard or ISSA or any other security chapter? If you go to a meeting, again, that's going to be a CPE for 1 hour that you spend at the meeting. The majority of those are about 2 hours to 3 hours, especially if you volunteer to help set up. If you're a board member, that's even better because you get 40 CPEs per year that you're a board member of an information security related organization or entity. For example, I'm InfraGard Denver chapter, so I instantly get CPEs for that. Technically, I don't have to do anything outside of that. But unfortunately, though, I'm one of those addicts that's always doing something. So I have about, for the first 1.5 years of my session, I have over 1,800 CPEs. So, but yeah, 25 questions are going to be beta for research purposes. And usually these questions are going to be put into basically the pool. And if a lot of people fail those questions or specific ones, they end up taking them out. So it's one of those things to where they're testing the waters for the actual questions. What's really interesting about ISC Squared, they will actually have these SME groups or subject matter experts come together in a specific hotel or whatnot and stay there for 2 to 3 days. Basically, they go through what's called item writing workshops. In these item writing workshops, they'll have it to where, of course, you have, let's say, 15 people. They each write a few questions, and then they argue about the wording until it gets ironed out to where it's comfortable with everybody in the room, the wording for the specific questions. Then it goes from there, then it gets vetted by ISC Squared. Then it gets vetted by an international community. So there's, every once in a while, some of the beta questions may be worded a little bit differently because throughout the vetting process, a couple words may have been changed to make it look more friendly or more international, but it changed the context of the original question. So if you do come across an item that just doesn't make sense with the content of what it's asking for, there's a possibility that may be a beta question. Okay, you get about 6 hours. Average is about 4.5 hours. And if you do not speak English as your primary tongue, then you can basically petition for an extra hour for that 7th hour. And if you don't speak English as your main language, then you could also bring in a dictionary. But it has to be vetted by the proctors. Because I guess they had a lot of people bring in dictionaries and they wrote notes into it and circled specific key content. So that's definitely a no-no. What's relatively nice about ISC Squared, granted it is 6 hours, but the majority of the proctors are relatively lenient enough to let you bring in bottled water or anything with a lid on it, so try not to spill, and then quiet food. But if you bring in a bag of chips, a really crunchy, loud bag, you probably not upset the proctors as much as the people right next to you. Another thing about the test, they usually have 3 versions of the test, basically meaning that you'll only be taking one of them, but they'll basically have like A, B, and C. So when you're sitting right there, somebody will get A, you'll get B, the next person sitting by you is going to get C. So if you copy off them, you are going to fail. That's the main reason they did that. And also, it's paper-based. So it's not going to be computer-based. The reason why they stay paper-based is because of security issue. I guess it's harder to run off with a stack of questions if it's on paper than it is sniffing the network. So with this said, be very careful about the number on the question that you're at and the number in the circle that you fill in. So I have heard cases, and I've seen one individual that went through, and I guess they got to the end, they were off by 1. I wasn't sure if they were off by 1 too many or 1 too less, but they actually left the test early, really ticked off because they didn't want to go through and fix the problem. They probably still had about an hour, hour and a half left on the test. So definitely be very careful on that, because a simple mistake like that can cost you the entire test, and it's an expensive test to take. It's a little bit more than your average Cisco test. And then there's multiple choices. One answer is correct. Another interesting thing about the test, it is a test on how to take a test. So you do have to memorize everything, but when it comes down to it, it's more of the trying to get in the mindset of the question asker or the person that wrote the question, because usually there's going to be 2 absolutely wrong answers and then 2 potentially correct answers. You want the best answer out of the 2. If you see 3 answers that are correct, it's probably a double negative question. So if you look at it and then all 3 are all encompassing, you reread the question, you may see a not or an only type statement to where it makes it to the one that was originally incorrect is going to be the correct one. So definitely be careful of the double negatives. They're not as common from my understanding as they used to be, but they're also putting in a lot of cross-domain questions. So they might slip in a few more crypto, covering, let's say, application security or things like that, or telco. Then as far as crypto goes, IPsec is something you will have to memorize because they love IPsec. Okay, basically, the people that have taken the exam, it's definitely a good idea to talk to them just to see how they fared with it. For example, if they thought it was difficult, almost everybody thinks it's difficult, but a lot of people say, well, yes, it was difficult because of the type of questions they're asking. Because like I mentioned before, they do vet almost all their questions, and it's an evolving test. So the test takers that took it, say 2-3 years ago, may have a different experience than the ones that have recently taken it. Because, again, the questions are vetted out through the pool. Okay, some reasons why the exam is difficult. Covers a wide range of information. They call it the test that is 30,000 foot high, but also a mile wide and an inch deep. Because you have to know a little bit about everything, but you do not have to know the detailed specifics about the individual items. Granted, for example, like the telecommunications, you'll need to know subnetting, the different cable types, things like that, but you're not going to know how to configure a router. So it doesn't get granular enough to be quote-unquote the expert level, but it gets you wide enough to be at the management level. And that's the primary thing that this is for, is it's a management level certification. Even though the majority of propeller heads get it to become senior or whatnot. That's another thing with the CISSP. As far as marketing goes, it's probably the best security certification you can get because it's the most popular. And last time I looked at the stats, there's about 70,000 people worldwide that have it. And again, back to the 8570.1m, my understanding, or last time I read it, they're trying to get 110,000 people within the DoD to get CISSP certified, or IAT, IAM level 3 certified, which would be CISSP, CISM, CISA, and so forth by 2010. So again, there's a huge push for it, and definitely one I would suggest if you, by chance, do not pass it, it's going to be very valuable for if you take it again. But again, not to scare you too much, again, it's a test on how to take tests. You have 6 hours, so if you relax, you should be fine. It's also the one where, since there are so many questions, there's sacrificial ones as well. So when you take it, you come across one that you don't feel comfortable with, mark it, come back to it, it's paper. A lot of the questions will answer previous questions. So that's another fun thing about it. Because you'll come across quite a few things, for example, like IPsec that has a specific item, and they're asking you for the different type of protocols it uses. Let's say 30 pages later, you'll come across one very similar to that, specifically stating the protocols, and you can just go back to the other question. You can take notes, you just can't take the notes with you after the test. They also allow you to write all throughout your textbook. The textbook's the one that has your answers in it. You just can't take that with you as well. But yeah, the only one that's going to go through is going to be the thing goes to the Scantron with all the circles in it. It's one thing that, again, the proctor will be pushing you through is the circles. You want to make sure they're dark. But at first, probably not too dark, because if you want to change your answer, you might have to ask for whiteout. Same type of thing. They usually provide pencil sharpeners, but it's one of the things that I would definitely call the testing center prior to actually arriving there, just to make sure everything that you need. But usually they provide the pencils, pencil sharpener, everything like that. And usually it's not electric, so if you break your lead, it's not going to be an annoyance. Okay, type of questions. Very cognitive questions. You must understand the concept deeply to answer the questions properly. The majority of them are going to be at the mindset of you want least privilege, items like that. You want to mitigate risk to an acceptable level. I know it's not as bad as the CISM as far as the acceptable level portion, because they want you to know more of the mitigation strategies rather than where the acceptance is going to be lying. But that's the primary thing is that they really push throughout the CISSP, is if the item is worth putting mitigation or if you're just going to accept the item. For example, if it's a database with just colors of an application, chances are that's not going to be very valuable to an attacker. And if it's compromised, it's not going to be that big of an issue for the application. So you're not going to spend the same amount of resources as protecting the user database that actually has credit card numbers in it as well. Okay, this is a sample question. So who can get the answer? Which of the following is a reason to place security elements in a lower layer of the system's architecture? A, increases performance, provides a wider range of protection. B, increases performance and provides a more granular approach to access. C, allows for multitasking to not interfere or to be affected by the restrictions of the security elements. Or D, provides more control and flexibility in configuration of the user. What was it? Usually with security, you're not trying to increase the performance. You're trying to keep it at the same level of performance as it was while it was functioning. You're trying to make the security element transparent to the user, so they're not affected by the security control. So usually it's going to be, for example, yeah, probably C. Not to interfere or be affected by the restrictions of the security elements. And that's the primary thing that they want to push to, is that there's a lot of psychological aspects with security. If you put too much security in place, they can make the items more secure, of course, harder to get to, but the people are probably going to try to bypass it by default. For example, like user passwords. Those are a fun one. Passwords are more secure the longer they get. The caveat is the longer they get, the more likely they're going to be doing passphrases. And passphrases are going to be common words, sentences, things like that. They may change an A with an @ sign, but you're minimizing the scope with the characters that you're going to be putting in there with the longer the password. For example, the 15-character higher password with Windows NT. Basically, because of LM hash, you have to do 15 characters or higher to make sure it doesn't save a hash on the system, because that's relatively easy to crack. But once it gets too long, not only are people going to be using common words, common sentence structure with just different variables, but they also tend to write them down. The sticky note is one of the biggest enemies of the information security realm. It's because usually people put a sticky note with a username and password on their computer monitor, sometimes underneath their keyboard, try to hide it. Sometimes if they have a file cabinet or a rollout drawer right on usually the right-hand side, it's going to be on the top shelf or the top drawer, in their wallet, their purse, items like that. And if it's in a wallet or a purse, usually they'll have a lot more information because they don't think anybody's going to steal their wallet or purse. And they'll have not only account information, such as username and password, but usually what it's associated with. And my favorite, especially from pen testing and the forensic side, is the good old text file. A lot of people will put their usernames and passwords in a text file or a doc file, though they won't encrypt it or anything like that. They'll also put the account information, usually on their desktop or their My Docs folder. Or sometimes, if they really try to hide it, it may be on the C drive or in the root folder. So that's definitely a fun one to play with. Okay, next question. Clipping levels can come in many different forms. Which of the following best describes the benefit of using a clipping level? And clipping levels, same type of scenario to where you have 3 tries and you're out, or 3 strikes and you're out with the username and password. So when you try to connect to somebody remotely, after the 3rd time, it either locks the account or temporarily locks the account. So A, detection of IP spoofing and resetting a configuration. B, alerting IT staff of attacks. C, reducing the amount of unauthorized users from logging into a system. Or D, reduction in investigation by the IT members. In this one, it's going to be C, reducing the amount of brute forcing or unauthorized access. Because if somebody's brute forcing it over and over by the 3rd time, especially if it has a 15-minute timeout, that usually breaks the majority of brute forcing programs out there. Okay, requirements. Like I mentioned before, they have changed that recently. It's actually in October, so it wasn't too terribly recently. But you have to have a minimum of 5 years of experience and 2 CBKs. And then, or you can have 1 degree, which substitutes as a year of experience. So 4 years and then a degree. A registration letter from IC², usually give you a candidate ID as well. Basically, it makes it to where you can take the test. And then you can write in booklets. Pencils will be supplied. The booklets are going to be the ones with 250 questions in it. And when you get on the site, the proctor is going to go through this as well, but you're not supposed to open up the booklet until the test actually starts. They do allow you, if you have a scratch paper, as soon as the test starts, to do a brain dump, and everything that's in your memory, just write it down. I know some people that does help as far as reminding them what's going to be covered on the test, because I know a lot of people will basically have it's called a mental reboot whenever they're taking the test and completely forget the majority of the stuff they've studied. So definitely, if they give you the capability of bringing in blank paper, or if they have paper there as well, just start doing a brain dump right as the test starts. And if English is not your native tongue, you can bring a non-technical dictionary. And that's the key, is the non-technical dictionary. I guess they don't like the hacker dictionary either. Okay, this week's schedule. Each day, we're going to try to cover 2 domains. Some of the domains are bigger than others, so one day we might be able to cover a domain and a half. Next day, it might be 2.5 domains. But usually, we're going to try to end at the end of the day, which if we start at 8:30, is probably going to be 4:30 or 5. Going to have a capability of asking questions. Again, 5 days of lecture. There are no labs in this class because the CISSP is not a technical test. I do suggest, how many people here are taking the CISSP at the end of the week or within the next month or 2? If you're taking it that soon, I would definitely suggest at night studying, at least probably half an hour to an hour a night. This is a very large test. We're going to cover everything that's going to be on the test, but the issue is if you don't study, it's a level of effort issue. A lot of people will go in there with the expectations, well, they took a boot camp, they didn't study the night before, they should be fine, and then have a rude awakening. So I definitely suggest taking time to study. There's another site out there. Actually, you have to sign in to get into it because they're trying to prevent spiders from getting everything. But how many people here have heard of cccure.org before? The site is actually a really nice site. And it's cccure.org. And again, I'll have this text file available for anybody that would like it. But this one here has a section directly for CISSP study tests. And you can have it to where you can practice with a 250 question test if you want, or you can specialize on the domain of interest.
It's free.
What was that?
Yeah,
it's free. It used to be you didn't have to put in a username and password. So I guess in that aspect it's not free because you'll probably get email afterwards from that site. But yeah, it's definitely free and it's an interactive engine. Unlike the real test, which is the paper test, there's no interaction, but it'll at least tell you what score you're getting on the test. If you take a look at it, the first time, let's say if you score, it's not uncommon for a person with a lot of experience to score like a 40 or 50 the first time they take it. But before the test, I would definitely play around with it. And if you get about say an 80, 85 consistently, then you should do well on the test, as long as you relax and basically skip the questions to go back to later for the ones that are throwing you off. But it's a really good resource.
Do they have just one test, or are there several versions of the test?
They have a large test bank, and they're randomly chosen. So, and then you can have it to where, like physical security, if you're weak on, you can not only pick physical security, but the difficulty of the question. And what's nice about this site is they'll actually have references to where the answers actually are. So they'll go through, and I guess on a technicality, the content on that site may differ from the actual test, just because the people that wrote the question may think differently than the 4 books that they reference on CCCURE. But generally, if you can get 80-85%, you should do fairly well on the CISSP test. The nice thing about the CISSP versus the bad thing, which is in both the same aspect, is that if you do fail, it gives you a mark out of where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are. So you know where to better push your study habits. However, if you pass, they don't tell you the score, they don't tell you your strengths or weaknesses, they just say, have fun. They give you your pass letter, usually in the form of an email, and then within 4 to 6 weeks you usually get your certification. But yeah, if you do fail, it does give you the strengths and weaknesses.
How long do you find out after you take the exam whether you pass the test?
Usually 4 to 6 weeks. However, again, depending on the moon, I guess, there have been cases to where people would find out within a week. And for example, at the beginning of, I think it was last year, or could have been this year, it's been a long time, but there was a rash of people that found in within a week. But traditionally, it's been 4 to 6 weeks. And that was probably because the mass insurgence of people taking it for the 8570. So that's one thing that, again, a lot of people are required to do for their job. One thing as a forewarning, from everybody I've talked to that have been taking the test and other individuals outside of IC², the pass rate has actually dropped in the last few years, not because the test has gotten harder, but because of things like 8570 and the commercial industry really pushing individuals to get their CISSP. And a lot of the individuals are either A, not in the industry, it could be either sales or their background is in logistics, not cyber warfare or information security. So it's going to be a lot harder for those individuals because either A, they don't have the background or they don't have the interest. Because if you're really interested in information security, it's going to help you a lot on this, especially for the memorization. If you're not, then it's probably, you're going to be stuck using lots of caffeine products to go through the manuals. And basically the main reason I have this up there for everybody's interest is for effects value. But what I usually try to warn everybody on all the classes that I have, there is an advanced ethical hacking class on the other side of the hall. Nobody that I know of over there, because they were in my regular ethical hacking class last week, nobody has an alpha yet, but this is a 500 milliwatt Wi-Fi card with a 9 dB antenna. So I'm getting almost all the residents in access points. Wi-Fi, especially unencrypted, is one of the worst technologies out there as far as security goes. I love Wi-Fi, don't get me wrong. It's great for ease of use. If you need to get connected to the internet, check things, it's great. But if you want to keep your secret, if you don't want people reading your email, definitely do not use an open access point that is not encrypted. Or at least use some sort of like SSH connection. So try to encrypt all your traffic, or VPN. I know a lot of organizations will have their IPsec VPNs into the company. So definitely use that to connect into and then connect out. Because this is playing backtrack, then I have Kismet running in the background, and it has it to where you not only see the traffic, but there's a few programs like Airpone, which allows you to not only see the traffic, you can intercept it and then rebroadcast it out. You're basically playing a timing attack. So you see the request going to the server, then you're trying to beat the server back to the client and respond back with whatever packet that you want them to see rather than what the server wants them to see. So for example, it's relatively easy to run Airpone or AirOwn and then either DOS the network by all HTTP traffic no longer working, or potentially injecting your own malicious code into whatever web page they're looking at. There's also a program out there called Wi-Fi Zoo on the new backtrack. That's a fun one to play with as well. Basically allows you to sniff the wireless device that is currently going through, or open up a PCAP and get the same information, and then do session hijacking with cookies. So if anybody logs into, for example, a bank, and the cookie says it's a valid connection, or the user's logged in, you don't have to have the username and password. You just load the cookie in your browser. And if you're on the same physical network, a lot of people will try to secure cookies by using the IP address of the client. But if it's going through NAT or a gateway, you have the same IP as far as the server is concerned. So therefore, you are now that authorized system and can... DHCP does not help because the IP address is going to be the gateway. So if everybody's going through the same internet connection, majority of server applications basically do reverse who's connecting to it. It's always going to either go to the proxy or the gateway or whatnot. So if it does, and the server application isn't strong enough to get things directly from the system, either by through JavaScript, VB, or an actual application, then chances are that can easily be faked as well. So again, as far as, I don't want to make people too paranoid, but the wireless is not very secure. Yes, sir.
With respect to the order or the sequence of the domains that we're going to study day to day, is it the same order that's in the book here?
Yes. The stuff that I'm going through here should be everything that's in the book.
So if we want to prep
Yeah.
the day before, we can follow
Yes.
the order that was booked?
What they tried to do is they built the book and then basically made it a PPT as well. So this should be identical to the book. But I definitely would go through these study questions at the end of the day especially. Those are not going to be relevant to the order of the book. Those are going to be a bunch of randomized questions for the main reason trying to get you used to how the test is going to be taken. So if you go through, for example, like the first 100 or the first 50 tonight, then you're going to cover stuff that we haven't covered and probably won't until Friday. So just as a forewarning. I know that some people have made comments about that as far as it'd be easier, but it's actually trying to get you ready for how the test is going to be written. Because unfortunately, the test, they don't have their specific chapters. It's just going to be jumbled up. So you might get a crypto your first question, and then a physical security your second question, and so forth. So any questions so far? If not, let's go and get started. Good old security management. Okay, basically we're going to cover security definitions and goals, the control types, risk management and analysis, of course components of security program, roles and responsibilities. That's probably one of the biggest issues right there. I know a lot of organizations don't push, is that they may have, say, a group of individuals that have overabundant rights to do a lot of things. When it comes down to it, there's no specific roles and responsibilities for if anything happens, who's going to get the hit for it. Also information classification, employee management, and your good old information security awareness training. How many people have to deal with that? IA training also, depending on the entity that you're working for, could also be called OPSEC training. Basically makes it to where everything that you do is supposed to be at the paranoid level. This is one of the few fields where paranoia is your friend. There's actually a healthy level of paranoia that everybody should be focusing on, especially in a business environment. Seems like when people get into an area where they trust, which is usually home and work, they become a lot more lenient than they are just off in the real world. For example, if somebody were to ask you for maybe a social security number, potentially even credit card number, right on the streets, chances are you're not going to give it to them. But you're more likely to give social security information if you're at work or whatnot, because there's a lot of entities or a lot of, for example, software products or programs that you'll be dealing with that specifically require your social to tie you back to database records, because they no longer filter by name, they only do by social. So that's one of the things that you'll come across is a lot of people are being trained badly. So you have to go and counter that bad training by good information security awareness training. For example, back to the Wi-Fi. If you're ever on an unsecured network or a network that you do not trust, if you ever see a certificate that comes through and says the certificate is bad, and it gives you the option of no, do not accept the certificate, yes, not recommended, but accept the certificate or cancel, you always want to hit no. Because chances are, if it's yes, somebody is sniffing the network, doing some sort of ARP poisoning and certificate spoofing. So as soon as you hit yes, now somebody else is probably going to be sniffing all of your traffic. The challenge with that is a lot of people have PKI certificates or PKI servers in-house, and the administrators don't go through and actually make it to where they're trusting their own domain. So now what they're doing is forcing everybody into the habit of, as soon as they see the pop-up box, hitting yes and instantly trusting it. So if you do that and somebody's listening that's a bad guy, they can now read everything that you're doing in clear text, even if it's through an HTTPS connection. Because you're connected to them with an encrypted connection, it decrypts it so they can sniff everything, and then they encrypt it from their system to the real server. So it's basically becoming a man in the middle. Okay, evolution of security. You have your good old internet or outside address. You have your perimeter. The definition of perimeter has also been relatively variable. From the CISSP perspective, the perimeter is from the company to the internet, not the database to everybody else. So just keep that in mind as far as the internet's concerned, or the CISSP. The perimeter is from the untrusted network into you, which the untrusted is probably going to be internet. If, however, you have quite a few remote sites, let's say VPN access or whatnot, there's a lot of times what you'll have to do is treat them as internet users. VPN, wireless, anybody that has a dial-up connection, they should always go through like a DMZ or protected subnet process, and then everything they do should be vetted. Because the best thing to attack in a large organization, because usually the main office or the main entity is going to have really good perimeter protection. So you attack some of their branches, some of their fingers. Once you compromise one of those, if they do trust those entities as a regular system, now you have full access into the network. So those are some of your primary targets. Okay, good old security definitions. We have your vulnerability, otherwise known as an undocumented feature. You have your weakness in a mechanism that can threaten the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of an asset. For the CISSP from ISC squared, the CIA Triad, or if you're across the pond, they call it the IAC, or because they hate the term CIA Triad. But that's something you have to memorize. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You may come across a question that tries to throw you off on the actual words or the definition of each. There's threat, an item or some sort of asset uncovering a vulnerability and exploiting it. So it could be an individual, it could be just some sort of software or some sort of actor or asset. Risk, it's the probability of a threat becoming real and corresponding to potential damages. You also have exposure, when a threat agent exploits a vulnerability. And exposure is a huge factor in the decision process if you're going to mitigate, if you're going to transfer, or accept the risk, which basically comes down to if your exposure factor is 0 because you have, say, a Windows 98 system that doesn't connect to anything and nobody connects to it, then chances are that's not going to be as important in the security tree as a web server that's on the internet and your DMZ, which everybody's going to be hitting probably 2,000 times a second. Okay, countermeasures. It's a control put in place to mitigate potential losses or to mitigate risk. So when it comes down to it, if you do not want to accept the risk, you want to mitigate it, it's not going to, the countermeasure is not going to be 100%, but it's going to be percentage-wise to make it to where the residual risk is either going to be accepted or transferred. Okay, definition relationships. There's the threat agent, which basically goes through, finds the threat, which exploits the vulnerability, which leads to risk, which can damage the asset, back to how much exposure it has either on the internet or internal. And then, of course, the countermeasure. And once you go through this model, you'll pretend to be, for example, through threat analysis, you'll say, what access does a script kiddie have to the web server? And a script kiddie is basically somebody that downloads scripts off the internet, usually doesn't know how they work, and then targets the system and then lets it go. Probably more damaging attackers out there because they don't know the potential downfall of what they're actually doing. So you pretend to be a script kiddie. You know that there's specific threats that can be taken over by script kiddies or some of the viruses that are out in the wild. So you find the vulnerability, do the risk assessment, and then you put a safeguard, which would be antivirus or patching. And then you just go through the entire process of what threat agents are actually out there. Okay, what we're going to do is cover your good old control types, the confidentiality and integrity and availability triad, and defense in depth or layered security. How many people here deal with layered security? From a basic aspect, it could be you have a firewall, you have an IDS or an IPS, and then internally, of course, you probably have antivirus and potentially even host-based IDS and IPS or firewalls, and then go through that area, which would be the network side, and then you may also be doing assessments. So there's lots of ways to do defense in depth or layered security, but the primary thing that they want you to know is it's either different technologies or different methods layered. Okay, we're going to cover administrative controls, management responsibilities necessary to protect assets, soft controls, your technical controls, and physical controls. These are also things you will have to memorize because they will cover many different domains and they're going to push this a lot. Can anyone give me an example of an administrative control?
Limit rights, user rights.
Yep. Policies and procedures, which allows you to limit rights, things like that. The technical controls would be the item in there that actually does the limiting, such as access control lists or potentially user rights to be able to create users. But the
Active Directory follow technical controls?
yes. And even though it's a software and whatnot, it's technical because it actually does the hardware work or the hard work or the workhorse, whatever you want to call it. And the administrative would be the policies you put in place to enact the Active Directory. And of course, the physical controls the protection of the facility's perimeter and internal resources. So that, of course, would be your man traps, fences. What was that?
ID badge.
Yep. That's definitely a fun one. How many people here have done pen testing before? It's the physical is probably one of the most fun because you can usually get past a lot of things. If you can't get into the network for some reason or another, a lot of times you'll be able to do social engineering to get in. I've had scenarios to where I have a badge and either have Mickey Mouse ears or I have a picture that I print off on a color printer to make sure that it is definitely fake, and that if you look at it, you'll see that it's a piece of paper. And I usually have it on top of a hotel swipe card. So again, it looks real. If they look at the back of it, it's going to have its good old strip and whatnot. But it's amazing how many times physical security will not take a look at the actual ID badge. So you can push it to them, they look at it, they say, well, it looks normal, just go on in. It's definitely a fun thing to do with the ID badges. And then there's good old tailgating. So it works great is if you wear a suit or you do business casual, you have your arms full of books or have something in your hands, computers or whatnot, and ask if, sometimes you don't even have to ask. You just look like you're struggling and people will hold the door open for you because their nature to help people out, especially in a place they trust. They probably wouldn't do that quite as much in other areas, but at work especially, depending on where you work or the environment that you're in, you should be very paranoid and basically, even though they look like they're struggling, they're going to drop all the computers, ask who they are, ask for identification, and if they can't provide it, contact security. But yeah, physical is definitely a fun one to play with. Okay, soft controls. You have your policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. Of course, there's employee management, testing, and drills. Of course, there's the good old the fire drill, and then there's also, for example, data recovery drills. So, for example, you say that say we lost a database. How fast is it going to take for us to back up or restore the backup for the database and go through things like that? There's also risk management and analysis, information classification, and of course your good old awareness training. And awareness training is probably the most cost-effective mechanism you can put in an organization because you're trying to train people on what not to do. And then going back to the PKI certificates, because I know a lot of organizations, especially probably people in here have come across that, is that if a PKI server is put up into the organization's area and they don't trust on the system, basically they're training them the wrong way to trust something they shouldn't trust. And then of course information classification works in both the commercial sector and the government sector. For example, the good old Economic Espionage Act. That basically states that if somebody steals a trade secret and makes a profit on it, either sells it to somebody within the US or a foreign entity, which is going to be a different level of punishment. But basically, they can get arrested or fined by the Economic Espionage Act of 1986. With that being said, if the organization sees that as being a quote-unquote trade secret, but they don't protect it as such, and they don't mark the classification on the information as such, then it is not a trade secret. So the person's not going to be in that big of trouble for stealing it, compared to if it was marked as a trade secret and there were certain access controls or security mechanisms in place. Ecological controls. Of course, you have your firewall, your IDS, your encryption, your protocols, authentication mechanisms, auditing, access control technologies. So basically anything in place that, of course, is technical, hardware related, or potentially even software related, which is going to be your password device. For example, like the shadow file on a Unix box. That is going to be logical access control or technical access controls. Things that you will have to memorize the differences of. Going back as far as the different control types, you're going to have your administrative control, your technical control, and then your physical control. But within those, there are multiple layers of control as well, such as, for example, there's of course the logical is the technical, but there's going to be other items that you can cross-reference. But these are the primary parents that you have to memorize is the physical, the technical, and then the administrative. Okay, good old physical controls. You have your doors, windows, walls. The important part about a wall is, let's say if you have a server room or if you have a room with sensitive data in it. If you do not have the walls that are true walls, they go down from the base to the actual ceiling of the environment. People can actually, for example, go over the rafters or whatnot and then drop in through the ceiling or through the floorboards. I know a lot of environments that have the raised floor, so there's, let's say, 2 to 3 feet of space in there that people can actually crawl through and then go from one room and then pop up in the next room. So depending on the environment that you're in, a lot of them have to have true walls. Good old security guards and dogs. There's fencing and lighting, locks, environmental controls, and IDSs, or intrusion detection systems, which would mainly be, for example, like CCTVs in this aspect, or for example, like PIDUS, which would be big fences with razor wire, motion detectors on the fences for vibration, and basically trying to see if anybody's trying to jump over it or cut it, items like that. I know a lot of places do have the PIDUS fencing. The locks, these are fun ones. Basically, locks are only as good as the locking mechanism. The majority of the locks haven't changed in hundreds of years. So usually they're the pins in the cylinder. So the majority of physical locks, if they're not electronical or more advanced, are just there to keep out honest people. So you can have a 5-pin lock. You can get a lock gun, which basically has it to where it works off physics, to where it has the pick, which hits the pins, and then the physics has it to where the force is transferred from the bottom pin to the top of the pin, and then the top pins shoot up, and then you, of course, put pressure on the cylinder to turn it while the pick is actually hitting the pins. So some people can use those. Unfortunately, I am a pick gun retard, or really bad at it. So what ends up happening is I cannot turn the cylinder with a gun, but I can go through and actually use a pick. And depending on the state that you're in, jurisdiction and whatnot, they may or may not be legal. I know the majority of states they are legal to have without a permit, as long as you're not using them in the commission of a crime. Which goes back to a pen test. You should always carry your get out of jail free card with you, which is going to be your signature from the CIO, the CEO, the board of directors, base commander, wherever you're going to be at. You need to keep that with you. And hopefully 2 versions of it. So I've heard bad stories about somebody holding it in their breast pocket and it being taken out and ripped apart by either the security forces or the IT management or whatnot, because they don't want to get in trouble. So keep the second, usually in an easy to find place. I've seen some people in a red team put it in their sock, so they have 2, and then their secured one. But yeah, definitely on the physical side, it's a very good possibility if you're not careful, or even if you are, if they have a good security posture, you may have guns pointed in your face very quickly. Okay, CIA Triad. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is keeping your secret secret from the people you do not want to read the information. There's prevents unauthorized disclosure of data, so they have to have the specific keys. Protects sensitive data and processes from things like shoulder surfing and social engineering. How many people here know what social engineering is? There's actually a really good book out there for those that want to get more detail. It's by Kevin Mitnick called, what is it, The Art of, I'll get back to that in a little bit. But it's not The Art of Intrusion, because that's his Black Hat book. But basically it covers a lot of good social engineering tricks and basically his past in doing social engineering. But you're trying to get information from a target that they normally wouldn't give you, such as usernames, passwords. And another thing that's also considered social engineering that you normally wouldn't think would be your good old dumpster diving. And dumpster diving is when you go into their garbage and then you try to find sensitive documents, which is actually still works to today. I know in a lot of areas, especially when they have tech support, even though they have a good shredding policy, you shred all documents with sensitive information. So if it's printed, they consider that to be a document. But then when it comes down to it, is that they write things down just because they're doodling, they're on a phone, so they have notepads, the yellow pads or even the white pads, whatnot. So a lot of times they'll have it to where those they don't shred because they don't see that as a quote-unquote document. And they just crumple them up and throw them away. And sometimes even the sticky notes with their usernames and passwords on them also get dropped on the floor. Cleaning crew comes in, throws them away, or steals them. So when it comes down to it, dumpster diving is still a very valuable item or attack tool. There's integrity. Deals with the accuracy, completeness, prevents unauthorized modification. Also deals with protection of data and protection of the environment from things like modifying data and changing security log information. Then availability. Availability is usability and timeliness, prevents from disruption of services, protects against man-made, technical, or natural disaster issues. For example, who can give an example of a man-made potential denial of service attack or man-made disaster?
World Trades.
Hmm?
Like
Yeah.
World Trades.
Explosions, terrorist attacks, items like that. Would-
Latvia attack. I
Sorry?
think it was in Latvia. Apparently, they had their whole computer system went down. The government computer system went down, and they said it was coming from Russia.
Yeah.
I think it's Latvia.
There's a few that are floating around in that space. But yeah,
Somebody deleting the world file.
see, that's one that a lot of people don't consider a security incident when it should be. User error. Is that, yes, there wasn't an attacker with malicious intent from the outside, but a user either deleted it or fat-fingered an account number and transferred information or money from one area to another area that shouldn't have been touched. But yeah, it could be actual cyber attacks, explosions, or user, yeah, the TSTO errors. The natural disasters, of course, are going to be your floods, your tornadoes, and items like that, which really pushes into the business continuity planning. Because a lot of people will choose a location and not do the research of what natural disasters happen in that location. So for example, if they chose Florida because they like the area, but they don't consider hurricanes. And if they don't build their organization or entity to withstand hurricanes and potential flooding, then for one thing, they're not showing their due care and their due diligence, but they're in probably for a world of hurt. Same thing, for example, lived in Montana for a while. If people were not counting on blizzards, frozen pipes, items like that, which could also cause flooding in a data center, that's going to be a huge issue as well. It's also a failure of a competence or a device or components, also competence, and also denial of service attacks. There's several different types of denial of service attacks. The primary one that's most effective, especially today, is legitimate connection from an illegitimate user. For example, these good old DDoSs, or distributed denial of service attacks. Somebody would have a botnet. What they do is make a legitimate connection to, let's say, port 80 on a specific IP address. When they do it, they're just waiting for the timeout, which could be 30 to 90 seconds. Average is usually about 90 on a lot of the web servers out there today because they think it's a legitimate browser. You can even pretend to be a legitimate browser, such as sending, let's say, user information, pretending, let's say, you're a Mozilla versus IE or whatnot. And then you just leave that connection open and then make more connections. If you have a botnet with 10,000 systems, let's say you make 100 connections from each computer, you can easily take up all the available resources from that web server if they don't have good, say, quality of service or load balancing. So if a system or a web server only has one IP address, you can take it down with ease with a botnet of 10,000. But if you're a larger organization that has 400 servers that are all doing load balancing, chances are if they're attacking the domain, you're not going to be able to take it down with any relative ease. Because the whole issue is to make the attack more expensive for the defender than it is for the attacker. Which if you have more bandwidth, it's going to be less expensive for you percentage-wise than them. Another one is, let's say if they have a T1 and you have a T3, or if you have fiber connection, have lots more bandwidth than they do, make a data transfer and then just take up all of their available bandwidth. So that's another form of denial of service attack. And usually when those happen, it's because of misconfigurations of the network where they didn't do a QoS. For example, let's say if they have VoIP and they have several other protocols that are going through and they didn't specifically say, okay, 20% of the pipe is going to be for VoIP, 20% for data transfer, 20% for web traffic. So if you take up 100% of their pipe, you now just took down their phone system as well sometimes. Okay, good old layer approach. Either security in layers or defense in depth. Basically provide layers of defense the attacker must compromise before accessing an asset. Provides, this is not relying upon just one control, I've seen a lot of people would go through, and for example, they'd have their Cisco PICs on the outside, and then they'd have some other firewall on the inside, such as either Sonic or choose your poison type of firewall or whatnot, to where if they do an exploit on one iOS or one operating system of hardware, the same exploit is not going to work on the internal layer. So that is one, even though they're the same devices, such as firewall, it's different technology or different operating systems. And also understanding that compromising one layer may take place and having a backup to compensate for this. Another issue too is, for example, if you have your firewall, let's say if you have a bunch of VPN users, they go into a protected subnet, and then from within that VPN, of course, you're going to have, if it's IPsec, full ports availability and whatnot. You can have it to where, now from there you have an ACL where only port 80 is allowed through. So they can get to web pages, or port 443, so they can get to encrypted web pages. Okay, building foundation. The security program. Basically, the blueprint of a security program is what's very important for an organization, because that's going to eventually become the baseline where you want to get to. How many people here deal with CNA, or certification and accreditation? It's definitely a fun thing to do. So those of you who haven't, certification is basically you write down on paper or your contract where you want to be in the security posture. So for example, on the CMM, let's say you want to be CMM level 4, which is security posture of, say, manage, or it's not optimized, but you want to make sure everything's documented and so forth. So once all the policies and procedures are in place, you go through and then you want to make sure all of your systems meet that baseline. Once they meet the baseline, then it's quote unquote certified if it goes through the audit process and finds out that everything's good to go. And then the accreditation portion is the owner, the DAA, or the CIO, or whoever's the responsible for the network signs off on it. And then what you're supposed to do from within there, within the security program, because you already have the baseline set, is then test it every so often to make sure that people haven't gone underneath the baseline. So it's always at a minimum of that baseline. Okay, the building security foundation. Again, the security program hits back to the security baseline. Enterprise security. Management's expectations. Basically, mitigate risk, user productivity, and cost. User productivity is a huge issue, especially you can make an environment a lot more secure, but if it's going to cause people to be less productive, then it's actually going to be a big issue. For example, the cost will go back down to how productive they are. For example, let's say if you have CCTVs in an area. A lot of people get paranoid if they're not used to it, especially if it's the first time, and if it's right next to their cubicle, watching what's on their monitor, they're not probably going to be as productive as they would have if the CCTV was not pointing at their system. And then also, security should not get in the way of productivity. As far as, I know one area that I was working at, they had this man trap. So before, you have to give your ID to the guards just to get into the area you park, and then to go further into the area, you have to go through this portal, which had a man trap, which had several biometric sensors on it. It had the weight, and then it also had a retina scanner, and then it had your swipe card that you had to put your PIN in. And then you have to go through, and then they validate you are who you are. If things fail, then they send somebody out there to basically either A, let you out, or B, authenticate you. The issue with that is, because there was a retina scanner, a lot of people did not want to use the retina scanner because the potential damage their eyes. It wasn't proven that it could damage their eyes, but there were pilots on there that threw the excuse that they would not go through that. So they ended up turning off part of the biometrics. But they still kept the weight sensor. So basically it gave you 25 pounds. So a lot of people were probably failing right after Thanksgiving and Christmas. But it's one of the things to where too much security could prohibit the entry. Then of course cost. Management assumes that security is always built in. That's hardly the case, especially in programming. A lot of times you get a bunch of software developers, and from the management perspective, they think it's going to automatically cover A, B, C, and D. But the majority of programmers only have specific time or budget. They just want the functionality there. They're not going to be putting in the access control unless you specifically tell them to, and then a lot of the other items, because that's going to be above and beyond just even natural training, especially people that come right out of the educational system. The majority of programming classes are specifically there for, say, build a database, not build a database securely, because that would be a completely separate class. But I've seen a lot of scenarios where people would hire a software development firm, come out with an item, and it was supposed to be FIPS 140-2 compliant, but they actually didn't go through that in the specs of the software development. So what ended up happening is they went to the company and of course said why it should have been. They said it wasn't in the contract, and then it came back down to either A, the organization fixes the code by revising the contract, or B, the organization does some sort of other method to encrypt the data going from point A to point B, which it could be an VPN using IPsec or SSH or whatnot.